Good evening. Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Govan, Director, LACMA. I don't know if I know everyone, but I think I do by this time. I am very happy to welcome you here tonight for our Director Series, and I'm super excited that this talk corresponds with a news event. If any of you read the LA Times this morning, we announced our partnership, LACMA and the Autry Museum of the American West, in a really, what we think will be an unprecedented and broad collaboration between our two organizations. And so tonight I'm going to be talking with W. Richard, or Rick, as we know him, West, Jr., President and CEO of the Autry Museum of the American West. And I'm just so excited about this. And Rick and I have become friends, collaborators, schemers in many ways in terms of what we might be able to do together in Los Angeles. But I've watched his success from afar. And I knew him, I grew up in Washington, D.C., and was always interested in what was going on with the Smithsonian. And as I was going through college and coming back, I heard about this new museum, the National Museum of the American Indian, that was being made on the Mall in Washington. And I had so many questions about it and so much interest in it. And of course, Rick was the founding director of that museum. He brought it into being for the nation, for the Smithsonian. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But people may not know that before then, I know many people know him well here, he practiced law in Albuquerque in the Indian-owned New Mexico law firm of Gover, Stetson, Williams and West. And then he moved to Washington, D.C., where he was also an attorney and a partner and a counsel to American Indian tribes, communities and organizations. Interesting to me, when I first met him, our conversation was about the fact that he was the son of an artist, which we will also talk about at Bacone College, and who taught and chaired the art department there in Oklahoma. And he holds a bachelor's degree in American history, magna cum laude, from the University of Redlands, not far from where we are at LACMA, a master's degree in American history from Harvard University, and on and on and on, including that he is a citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho Nation of Oklahoma and a peace chief of the Southern Cheyenne. He's an amazing guy, and we're so lucky to have him in Los Angeles. So please welcome Rick West. So many people here are part of LACMA and the Autry. I just want to say a thank you. Jane Burrell organizing these director series, but also Nancy Thomas, our deputy director, who's been involved from LACMA's side, and there are others. But we now have a kind of convening, it's not quite a merger, but a collaboration beginning between the Autry and LACMA. And I think it started over lunch.
It did.
In discussion not long ago.
And it was just basically a courtesy on your part. When I first came here to Los Angeles, almost exactly 5 years ago, I was there was a small reception for me, or a reception that was held for me in arriving here, since I know lots of the directors here. Michael could not be there. He was off somewhere else. And you did me the courtesy of calling up after that and saying, well, let's have lunch anyway, even if I couldn't be there. And from that came this, which we're doing tonight.
So the idea of the announcement, and some of you may have read about it in the Los Angeles Times, is that we were talking about the fact that we all collaborate. Art museums are friendly, or museums are friendly, and we loan works back and forth. We share scholarship. We share exhibitions. But there's something different about the fact that we still live within our enclosed bodies. Mm-hmm. And I always find this strange thing when we're looking at even collecting works of art, and we say, well, we look at LACMA's collection, and I notice, for example, we don't have a lot of 19th century Western American painting. Mm-hmm. We have almost very little Native American art. And so what is the criteria for which we buy things and look at things and form a collection? And we're talking about the fact that, well, Los Angeles, we're so close, we share everything. Shouldn't we just be thinking together? Mm-hmm. And someone said to me in the Times, they said, well, yeah, you loan work back and forth anyway. I said, but that's different. Even a loan form is a barrier. And so the question was, we speculated, how many barriers could we remove between our institutions, our collections, our curators, and our scholars? And we're just at the beginning of that, maybe.
I think that's right, and it's even beyond. I think the potential of the relationship is really even beyond the process and the mechanics of sharing collections, collaborating with respect to curatorship, exhibitions, programming, that kind of thing. It just seems to me that in Los Angeles, there's a particularly remarkable opportunity in this way. I myself feel that, and you and I actually talked about this way back at the beginning, that there is a kind of a moving of axes, if you will, that are happening. I think with respect to art in this country, we have always looked at it as being on an east to west line, Europe, United States, East Coast, West Coast. And you told me way back when that was one of the reasons you actually left the East Coast, and you wanted to come to the West Coast and look east and make sure that people understood that. And so that's one of the shifts that's occurring. And I think there's even more potential, because I think both LACMA and the Autry Museum of the American West have great respect for what I would describe as the North-South axis of art and culture. And I think that therein lies even more potential that goes beyond even the more predictable elements of a collaboration, sharing collections, sharing exhibits, that kind of thing, where we really have an impact, if you will, on curatorship and the intellectual grounding that we use to look at what we do.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were talking about the fact that for whatever strange reasons, in part I think because the Natural History Museum had some, in Los Angeles, had Native American art, that LACMA had almost none, yet our collections south of the border are one of the most significant collections of Latin American, ancient Latin American art of the ancient Americas in the world, and even more diverse even than some of the museums in Latin America.
Correct.
And yet it stops at the border, and that's so strange. And we were talking, we recently bought a work from the Pacific Northwest, and we talked about the fact that we looked at our collections. There's an incredible resource of indigenous cultures from north to south along the Pacific that is one of the greatest in the world, and great for Los Angeles, just working together.
I think that's right, and of course, Native people would be the first community to tell you that those borders that have divided all of that up were not ours; they were somebody else's. and so I think that is an opportunity too, and because of the nature of your holdings of Native material and our holdings of Native material, we can construct collaborations along an immense spectrum of time and art and all of that. I think that's exciting.
Nancy Thomas was reminding me, of course, as we were talking about, when we were first talking about this, she said, of course, we did a show in 2001 called Road to Hot Salon, which was about the sort of mythical Hot Salon, but the fact that there are no borders, that there's an imagination of a continuity, which takes us right to Pacific Standard Time, and thinking in that exhibition, Road to Hot Salon, there was not only native cultures and ancient cultures, but it brought us right to the present, and the fact that, okay, I guess those borders are really artificial and constantly changing, right? Even between museums.
They are, and they're much more. I think what the opportunity is here is sort of expanding how we look at all of that in many ways, both in terms of time and the time spectrum that we're talking about, but also, I think there's also the opportunity, even beyond the native collections themselves that both you and we have, to figure out how art that comes out of that cultural spectrum intersects with other art too, and I think there are even some of the things that we're going to show.
We're going to do a little preview of things we can do together. This is like a brainstorming session right here on the stage. But I want to actually, I love this slide. So we're of course building this new building, and of course I'm asking Rick his advice because he just went through long ago now, but a huge birth of a new museum. And I was looking at these two pictures at the organic shapes and the weird similarities of the National Museum of the American Indian. And we were just talking a minute ago about how Mr. Cardinal, who designed that museum, was a student of Bruce Goff.
Correct.
Who designed the Pavilion for Japanese Art, a work of organic architecture, which takes us back to the fact that Bruce Goff was in Oklahoma.
Correct.
Where Frank Lloyd Wright was, and they cooked up this organic architecture concept. And that Peter Zumthor, when he was looking at LACMA, he had a real affection for the wonderful pavilion because of its organic quality, and that if you wanted to make a museum that was in no particular culture's idiom, not European, not anything, one of the places you go is maybe nature, right? Organic, which is the principle of organic architecture. So I'm long-wind of connecting us here.
But it's the connection is very real, and I will tell you that. Well, one brief aside and backstory, and that's that when I arrived at the National Museum of the American Indian, I had been the director for all of 2 weeks, and I received a luncheon invitation from J. Carter Brown, the cultural denizen of the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and the director of the National Gallery. And his wonderful piece of architecture in the East Wing that sat directly across the mall from us was very nearby, and it was not an invitation one refused, so I accepted the invitation, and I went over, and we had lunch. We walked out onto his 7th floor deck over at the East Wing of the gallery, and he looked across at our spot over there, which was totally vacant. I think they played volleyball during the summer or something at that point. And he said, you know, you have really the last prime spot on the National Mall. And I said, yes, yeah, we do, and I'm very grateful for that. And I kept wondering, where is this going? And finally, the punchline was, and you should understand, he said with that luminous smile of his, I mean, he was the master of public relations. He said, and I'm going to be watching you every step of the way. And he could do that because he was also the chair at that time of the DC Fine Arts Commission. He reviewed every single drawing that went into that building that you see up there. So, but the origins of that building, organic is the right word, because this building actually, just to state it briefly, was primarily the result of a long consultation period with Native communities themselves about what they wanted to see in this building. I consider that building to be really the first object in the collections of the National Museum of the American Indian. And there were a number of things that went into it. The fact that it had transparency, outside in, inside out. The fact that it was curvilinear and organic, the fact that it was surrounded by a habitat that was anything but Western landscaping. That area was, quite frankly, a marsh, and we attempted to return the habitat sort of to that state, realizing that we had to have a building there. So it was, and it's a place that unfailingly Native people, or even those who know something about Native people, can walk into and say, I understand why you did exactly what you did.
That's so interesting. In fact, you could use some of those words when I'm doing my PR for my building, so I'm going to appropriate some of that. That's really fine. Good. The inside, outside, all of that is part of this, and in an uncanny way, because I know he's never seen that building and never really thought, Peter Zumthor's never really thought that way, but there's maybe a commonality. So when I was coming back from, I was starting my career, I remember the beginnings of this museum and the conversation of this museum. And for me, it was super inspirational because, and I vaguely remember the discussions about how you couldn't build a museum today that was just about artifacts. Couldn't be a repository for artifacts. And I thought, how exciting. This is a new museum where you're engaging communities and where it somehow has to be about relevance, not about artifacts. Artifacts would be included, and they would be really important, and I know there was an effort to, but I'm interested in that, how you were defining the anti-museum museum, because there was a bit of that conversation.
Well, there was. I mean, there was a little bit that was deconstructionist in what we were doing with respect to museums, and we did enter the process. By that I mean we, the Board of Trustees, the staff of the museum, me as the director, et cetera, with a certain intentionality. And it was a little bit, you had to skate and dance a little bit about it, because this was a museum that probably holds the most significant, aside from the museum where I now sit, the most significant native collection in the United States. And so we had plenty of objects. That was not the problem. But we really felt that there was, in terms of mission and mission intention, there were other things that needed to be accomplished. This was a museum that, I think, had to somehow relate to the Native community in a way that bespoke them in their first-person voice about what was going on in that museum. It was, first of all, one of the things we found out in the consultation, which related to both the architecture and the programming, was that when we were in those consultations held throughout this hemisphere over a 2 to 3 year period, as I mentioned, probably 25 to 30 of those consultations, that one of the main themes was, don't you dare in that place talk about us as though we are not a living and continuing culture. And so that was one of our intentions. And so I guess the point was not that we didn't value objects, but that objects were not ends in themselves, and they had to be informed by a certain mission intentionality that was very, very important.
I'm realizing tonight how much I really did steal from you and thinking about this, because I do talk about that all the time, the multicultural living cultures of Los Angeles, and the whole point is a museum, anything we do has to be relevant to living cultures.
Yeah.
And that's the language we have to use. Now, of course, I see that I took that all from you. It's good to know.
It's my gift. That's, you know.
So I wanted to, so you have the most amazing life, as we were talking about it. You started as a lawyer and now have, and I think that has maybe something to do with your father was an artist. You became a lawyer, but your father was an artist.
Correct. Yes, and it was even more. It was even more dramatic than that. My father, who is on my right, your left in this photograph, was Dick West. That was his Anglo name. His native name in Cheyenne was Wafpanaya, which means Lightfoot. But he was an artist and a very prominent member of the Native fine arts community in Oklahoma, which was one of the originating forces in the Native fine arts community during the middle part of the 20th century. And so this picture, the picture was actually taken for Life magazine at the time I was appointed as the director of the National Museum of the American Indian. I actually consider it very Curtis-esque. You do see things, however, in transition, though. It is not totally buried in the romantic past. You have somebody who is also wearing sort of white man's clothing, along with his father. But the real relevance of Dad and his art to what we are talking about tonight is that, of course, my growing up as his son had an immense cultural impact on me. My dad basically took us back to Oklahoma after World War II to make sure that my brother and I grew up within the Cheyenne cultural community, and we did, and we have, and we still participate very actively in it. But Dad was an artist, and more than that, he was an artist who kind of lived at the boundaries. He went through studio training at the University of Oklahoma during the late 30s and early 40s. And that was at a time when, I don't know how many people there are in the room who are actually familiar with sort of the evolution of the Native fine arts movement, but there was an effort back in the late 30s and early 40s to revive the traditions of Native plains painting. And that sort of flat two-dimensional art that often showed up on the hides of teepees. And so my dad began there, but he went on to other places. And that's what I wanted to, both of these paintings are by my dad. The one on the right is probably considered a very traditional piece of Native Plains art. Native fine arts sort of characterizes him with respect to that. And the annotation that goes by my dad's name is that he was one of those who began taking it beyond purely flat two-dimensional art to art that had movement and dimensionality to it. It went more toward three-dimensional art. My dad's thesis at the University of Oklahoma, where he was, I think I'm correct, the first Native person to ever earn a Master of Fine Arts at the University of Oklahoma, was a thesis that had to do with the confluence of European modernism and Native Plains art. And that's what you see on the left. And interestingly enough, the painting on the right was done in the early 80s. The painting on the left was done in 1949. And I could sit here for half an hour and tell you the Cheyenne cultural dimensions that are embodied in the painting on the left, and I won't. But it is...
You could. That would be really interesting.
No, it is... but it was very, very important to him. And that's what I mean by our having the opportunity in a more global sense to sort of rethink some of these things as we put together your collections with our collections and our collaboration regarding curation. There is just lots of territory.
So it's so interesting to me, too, that so you have this work that seems vaguely European surrealist, but not quite. It's coming from somewhere else. And there's a change in art history now of seeing things like that as outside the norm, and yet now we're really interested in cities like Los Angeles, which are all mixed up and multicultural and cross. That these are the kinds of paintings people want to look at. It's a reframing, right, of interest.
It is. It really is. And to me, I've always resisted, which I have some capacity for doing since I've directed museums, to those who sort of assign my father to a particular category when I think he really should probably be in a different category, because there were just frontiers to be crossed at the time that my dad was painting back in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. One of them was to get off the walls only of natural history museums and onto the walls of art museums. That was one boundary. But it was also this what takes place as you get to borders and as you get to points of confluence and intersection. That's where I think museums do their best work. That is where the best art occurs, as far as I'm concerned, when there is almost a certain tension, ambiguity sometimes about how that spins out. And that, again, is what I see as a great potential of our very particular
Yeah, I mean, I actually see a change in art history from the interest in the kind of purity and ultimate expression of a particular form and its apotheosis to a real interest in the mixture of things, which comes with recognizing that the world is a mixture of things. I'm curious, so of course your dad was an artist, so you wanted to be a lawyer. My mom was a lawyer, so I wanted to be an artist. I can see how that goes. That means you became a museum director, I'll become a lawyer again. Anyway,
no, don't do that.
So did your dad give you advice when you were starting this museum venture? Because here his lawyer son was now in charge of the most important museum of art. What did he say?
Oh, well, the first thing he said, and I've never forgotten it, first of all, whenever he referred to me, not by my name, Rick or Richard, but by Buck, I knew something heavy-duty was coming.
And now you know what to call him in the staff meeting when it gets really heavy.
And so when I told him that I had accepted this position as the director of the National Museum of the American Indian, there was this mildly dramatic pause, and then he said, "Well, Buck, I'm glad you finally decided to earn an honest living." And the rest is history. But he was very... he was delighted that I had kind of circled back. I mean, it had been very difficult for my parents. As I said, my mother was a musician. My father was a visual artist. I became a lawyer. My brother became a banker for a number of years. And occasionally we'd see them sort of puzzling, what the hell happened here? But it was important, I think, to my dad that I kind of circle back. And yes, he did have very particular feelings about what should be done. He really did hope. Remember that when I was appointed as the director of that museum, it was sort of in that period of the late 80s and the early 1990s that was a period of multiculturalism. And it was basically, it took the form in museum communities of saying that those voices which have not been at the table of interpretation and curation should be there. And so it was a move to include, in a way. Now, the form it immediately took, I think, was multiculturalism in museum form as ethnic-specific museums. And so my dad certainly wanted me to act upon that, and felt that the NMAI, with its vast collection and its great resources, being a part of the Smithsonian, was a vehicle for doing that, and we did do that. The addendum I would add, though, which is important tonight and has a lot to do with our collaboration, is that multiculturalism eventually in the museum field became interculturalism. And by that I mean and that is the mission of the Autry, and that's why I'm sitting here talking with you, is that we really want to try to take on that task in telling cultural history and public history, of trying to figure out what the interweavings, the intersections, the interconnections, the interrelationships are. From the standpoint of cultural and public history, that is the best way to do it. From the standpoint of trying to spin out contemporary art history, that is also the best way to do it, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually, that we all know that there's a role for both, that there's the role for the general museum, which purports to deal with the totality of things and anything goes, that would be LACMA, and then the culturally specific museum, which can hold the flame of a more, it's true, it does become intercultural, and I think that a lot of people debated what's better, and I think the answer, of course, is none is better than the other. We need more permeability between, because if we can take the best of all those worlds, we not only can put together artifacts in a more comprehensive story, or stories, because they should be told from many ways, but yes, we can have our cake and eat it too, would be the idea, right?
Absolutely, and I find sometimes, I'm asked, well, why after being at the NMAI, well, of course, there's a general question. Why, after you went through that, would you risk kind of ruining your good reputation by trying to take on another museum directorship? I haven't found that to be a problem.
Because it's an upgrade. Right?
I haven't found that to be a problem at all. And it is, I think that is right. It's not that there is necessarily a wrong or a right, something is better or not better than the other. It is that somehow there should be this mutuality of permeability in how museums relate to one another.
And I think that's the conversation we had, is that our job now is, we built these institutions and there was that sense of team spirit and you make the place. But really now what's required is permeability. I think now that we have our institutions, we have our infrastructure, we have our expertise, we have our collections, now let's share and be permeable. And it'll take its form in many ways. Here's an example. We just acquired a work recently, upper left, that it's strength to strength in certain cases, right? Between our collections now as we're building.
That's right. Yeah.
In the Pacific Northwest as an example. And we acquired something that was not like anything you had, and I think in the future now, any decision and acquisitions in that area will probably consult each other.
Absolutely, and the Haida house posts that we have, which are on the upper right, are two of our prime objects. There's no question about that, and they have a direct connection with your object, which is on the left. What I would also add is if you drop down to the bottom image, that is actually an image that is a Northwest Coast object that is in glass, and that is done by Preston Singletary, who is a contemporary native artist. And one of the things that I love most about, which is referred to here somewhere, that I like most about Art of the West was that it had one of Preston Singletary's glass bentwood boxes right next to a 19th century bentwood box that actually had the same Northwest Coast pattern on it. So the notion is not only do we have this kind of connection, but again, it is a connection that can exist across a very important time span that comes right up to now.
Right up to the present,
yes.
Right, which is really clear.
Yeah.
So literally, we put these images together for fun, without lots of research. Bar Guadalupe on the left, but the idea was to take a look at just bringing images together in ways they might be if we can share collections.
Yeah, and I mean your object is a historic object. Our object is referential to a historic object, but it is made by a contemporary artist. And so there is an evocation, if you will, of what exists on the left. On the far right, you would really have what I consider almost an oppositional piece of art. It's by Harry Fonseca, and it is in his St. Francis series. And he was really attempting to say, through art, and very powerful art, what the California mission system meant, which is depicted in the two images to the left, what it meant to Native communities in the state. So there is this opportunity for kind of crossing all kinds of boundaries in that.
The exhibition Road to Hot Salon that I was referring to, very much as people here who work at LACMA know, again, brought us right up to the present, right up to the Chicano cultures that used Hot Salon as a symbol of an identity in present-day Los Angeles.
Yes.
Erasing those borders to places of origin and constructing an identity out of a different time frame.
That's really right. And it was interesting to me, and when we did La Raza, which we may come to a little bit later, the exhibit, which is now at the Autry, that in looking at those photographs, that image appeared repeatedly. And what is a historical matter is of note to me. I happened to be going to law school in Northern California when the Chicano movement was going on in Los Angeles in the late 60s and 70s. And Native people always felt a slight inclination toward the Chicano movement, even as contrasted with the African-American civil rights movement. And that was because, as indicated by that symbol, there was this thread of indigeneity that very much went through the Chicano movement and their art and their expression and those photographs that you see in La Raza. That's
present in the museum right now as part of the PST show that you're.
Yes,
exactly.
That's right.
Yeah, no. But what's interesting is how far the breadth of the possibilities when we started thinking about what's at both museums, and here is a sort of meditation on the sublime and landscape and literally these are images that were thrown together at the last minute, but we were talking about it and I was remarking that the image on the top left, our James Terrell Gonsfeld that was up recently as part of the Terrell retrospective, he designed as sort of cinemascope in width and really to reflect film and landscape.
Yeah.
And it is. It was for him a little bit an image of like the Western film without image. And his travels in its time in Arizona, the travels even as a kid living in Los Angeles and going there and seeing the skies and looking at this kind of painting is what informed his interest in an abstraction.
What I loved about this particular grouping here is exactly what you have just said about Terrell, who has always been one of my favorite contemporary artists. And then the image immediately to the right of that is a landscape by Emmy Whitehorse, who is a contemporary Navajo artist. And if you look at that landscape, which I think some would say is pure abstraction, there is much that sits in there that is anything but abstract. It is thoroughly ensconced in Navajo cultural territory, if you will, because that is a landscape which depicts, if I remember correctly, 3 of the 4 sacred peaks of the Navajo in Arizona and New Mexico. And there are even just spots of light that appear in it that are referential even to people in particular places. And the other thing that has always interested me about Terrell is his focus on place and the importance of it, and really almost always creating something that even in the work that you have described up here of Terrell's is holistic. There's something about it that just sort of encompasses a great deal, and that is definitely true of Emmy Whitehorse. Now, in juxtaposition with that, you have below it Melrose, which it shouts manifest destiny, and that's exactly what it was all about. And in a way, both of the works above it relate to that, but they're almost, they're from a different cant, and it's important to know all of them, frankly.
We were talking earlier about the fact that James Terrell has spent so much time in Arizona in his famous Rodin Crater project, which is a kind of Mount Meru, but sits in below the San Francisco peaks, which were so sacred, was a volcano also, and sacred to the Hopi, and that it was a Hopi man that he collaborated with in thinking about how to define sense of place. And what he always talks about is the uncanny affinities that get uncovered in a kind of multiculturalism of an approach to something like landscape. And that experience, in fact, has been so important to him, was working with the native cultures there.
I think that's true. This painting, I think, still is up in Art of the West. At least it was, if it's not up now. And that was always my favorite corner of Art of the West, which is a core installation of the Autry. It's our art gallery, really. And my favorite corner was the landscape corner. And it was exactly for the reason that you say, because the contrasting is so informative in all kinds of ways. And it gets at another boundary that I know is art museums and even those who deal with art exhibitions have to be very careful about. But if you're looking at a place like the Autry Museum of the American West, we have art collections, significant art collections, and we do art exhibits. But there is present in those exhibits always, and Amy Scott, our chief curator, and I have talked about it before, there's always this interlineation of culture that's just very close by when you're doing that. And again, both in this work as well as the project up in Hopi country that you're referring to, I've always had that same sense and sensibility about Terrell and what he's trying to do.
Well, that'll be continued. We'll have those discussions further about that. I just want to throw up a few other images just because we sort of had starting points. You talked about, we were talking about Edward Curtis before when you were talking about your own picture, but you have a Curtis on the left. And then you have this Mateo Romero and then the Wendy Red Star on the right. But, I mean, there's an hour lecture just about this.
Well, there is,
right?
There is, but it can be said relatively quickly, and that's that you do indeed have the Curtis on the far left, and that
which is from our collection.
Yeah, that's from the LACMA collection. And it is evocative of a very particular period of photography and romanticization of native cultures and communities. Then you have next to it, and I think he's sitting in the audience if I'm not mistaken, Mateo Romero's revision, if you will, of that in a work of art, which is honestly, in a certain way, revising or almost directly taking a poke at that kind of romanticization of native cultures that occurred with Curtis. And the painting is based upon a Curtis photograph. And then on the right, you have the work, the very wonderful work of a contemporary native photographer, Wendy Red Star, who's the daughter of an equally famous painter father. And what happens there, which I think is the most significant point, is that the camera gets turned around the other way. Curtis was a photographer's perception of it. Wendy Red Star, I can assure you, is looking at it through her own lens. And there is something to be said about that from the standpoint of both art and culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think even our photography collections and photography and painting as it emerges through the 19th and 20th centuries is going to be full of possibilities of comparison. We're not going to go through the entire collection of LACMA and the Autry tonight. Just don't worry about that. In fact, maybe we could speed up a little here. I think I'm going to go through a few things. Almaraz, our recent exhibition. I mean, I think what you said also about the indigenous and the Chicano cultures and the alignment that exists, I think in Los Angeles very uniquely. I mean, we have the largest Native American culture living here in population living here in Los Angeles.
Correct.
And I think there has been a wonderful back and forth that has existed. And of course, it's all American art.
It is. But that's been only recently recognized. One of the things that happened recently that speaks directly to that point, which just thrilled me, quite frankly. We had at the National Museum of the American Indian, two of our most distinguished collector patrons were Charles and Valerie Diker. They, within the past year or 2 years, gave their entire collection to the Met. And I know that we directors think collections are never to be conditioned at all, but I'm positive that this was a condition, even if not articulated as such. The Dikers would not transfer the collection unless the Met put it in the American art collection and not, as is often the case, assigned to Oceanic, or the others' art, if you will. And so I think that's occurring much more now.
Yeah, no, I think it's one of the most exciting things about art history now is how the definition of American art just keeps expanding in the most amazing ways. And honestly, our collections lack, I will admit to an honest disappointment coming to Los Angeles, sort of the end of the line, the West, and having spent so much time in the West, and finding very little in our collections of painting of the American West of the 19th century. We have some. They're very nice. There's some very generous donors who have made some gifts. But you would think, if you came to Los Angeles, that it would be full of those paintings. And that was part of I think what we were talking about is that contemplation of, should we embark on an effort to collect all that work, to make all those comparisons, or can we just share and think of it as one entity? So I think there is so much. We do have amazing, decorative arts, there is a lot to compare.
Yeah.
These are playful juxtapositions of our collections. We were looking at this when I think most of you have probably seen the Found in Translation exhibition at LACMA now, which is one of our PST shows that's about Southern California and Mexico. And of course, so much of what we consider American art of the West is related to Mexico. And whether we have the Spratling chair, which is very Mexican in influence, but it's by William Spratling, who's an American, or one of my favorite objects in the collection, Mary Coulter, an architect who had to get her architecture degree in Paris, because as a woman in the late 19th, early 20th century, you couldn't do that in the US, and we didn't even know she designed many of the most important buildings in the Southwest for the Harvey Railroad Company, and designed all this furniture because the drawings were stamped by a male engineer. So there's been a huge revival and interest over the last decades of her architecture and actually her design. And this is a chest that comes from Arizona, from Winslow, from the La Posada Hotel, which we both stayed at and have been scheming about what we can do in Winslow. So that's to be continued. And by the way, this is also in Wendy Kaplan's and Stacey, the exhibition Found in Translation. I was so proud that LACMA finally got a saddle in the galleries.
In a bowling saddle at
right.
That's the top of the heap. That's right.
But the hybrid quality of the mix of things, whether it's the saddle, which is made in Mexico, or the chair, which you can see has aspects of Mexico, arts and crafts, which has its origins in Europe and back and forth. I think that's what's exciting in art history now, and I think we can do that. We have an upcoming show of Mimbris that is going to be juxtaposed with photographs, but that'll take too long. I know we have to move on. I want to just for a second pause. We have an exhibition on view now that Rick and I were talking about by an artist that many of you may know, Richard Prince, who's an American artist working in New York. And he is famous, he became famous in the 80s for his images that he made photographs, appropriated images from the famous Marlboro campaign, which featured the romantic image of the cowboy in the American West. And this was, there was a huge retrospective at the Guggenheim, and we are showing an exhibition right now of his work that include his latest work, which takes some of the magazine of ads from Marlboro, but in this case, he's digitized out the text and left you with pure landscape. I should have shown another image, but in most of the images, you also see the torn edges of the magazine and the cellophane tape that tapes together these images as a sort of holding together of the American myth of the West. But what's interesting about the show is it also includes, Richard was charged with plagiarism by the photographers who took these images. And there was a battle that ensued about what this appropriation art really was. And there's actually a video that's in the exhibition where one of the photographers who made one of these images was so shocked when in New York he saw on all the bus stations his image, but the show was Richard Prince's show. And he describes going to see the Richard Prince show, seeing his images in it, and the first thing he said he wanted to do was take a photograph, but the guard said he couldn't because those images belonged to Richard Prince. And it's great to watch this video of the back and forth of appropriation and rethinking, but Prince is a very smart artist, and he started thinking about that a lot, and he actually went backwards from Marlboro later, and there are images in our exhibition like the one of the left by Peake, who was commissioned as an artist illustrator to make images that would inspire the photographers. So the photographers were actually working from these images, and here you can see a Frank Johnson painting on the right from your collection that is the real source for the photographer's images, right?
Correct. I think that's right, yeah.
And what's interesting, and here is Richard Prince's, on the right, image, by focusing his camera in on the full-page Marlboro ad. But again, doing this research, he wondered where did they come up with that idea, and it was, he traced that back, and in the exhibition are images of another photographer, McComb's images, that were featured on the cover of Life magazine, showing the cowboy, real cowboy, I guess, that the Marlboro Madison Avenue ad men were inspired by to commission the pastel artists to make the images that look like 19th century paintings that inspired the photographers that Richard Prince then made into his own art. So there you have the continuity of the of the Western art story, which puts the Autry right in the center of that, I guess, right?
Yes, a territory that we enjoy occupying very much. Because it is tremendous bandwidth, and with you now a collaborator in all of this, we certainly have the collections to attempt to do something very significant, I think, here.
I wanted to, where is all this going to, some of this is going to take place, is that this is, I wanted you to talk a little about your new resource building, since
absolutely.
This is brand new. And we're so jealous. We wish we had a space like this. So I wondered if you could talk a little about the Original Research Center, so we can copy you on that front as well.
Well, well, it is indeed a brand new building. It's not even officially open yet. We're still in the process of bringing it up to opening, which will probably be maybe a year and a half from now. Because we have a vast store of collections to move into that building that have come from elsewhere, both from the Autry and from the Old Southwest Museum collection, which has been in the Autry for over a decade now. But it is a facility that is pinned on how I think all good collections facilities in the 21st century, as contrasted with the 20th century, should be looked at, which is to say, it is much more quasi-public in nature. It is not simply the preserve of academics who come in small numbers to the facility each year. The definitions of student and scholar are defined more broadly in terms of people who should have access to it. It is not only where our 600,000 object collection will ultimately be housed, but it also has both the libraries of the Autry Museum and the old Braun Library of the Southwest Museum there. And the Braun Library, candidly, is the best library of its sort in the world. with respect to Native communities and culture. There's no question about that, and I said that even when I sat as the director of the National Museum of the American Indian. Ours was really not in the same category. So this has spaces. This is a library area that you're looking at here. It is where there are listening rooms, viewing rooms, etc., which create accessibility to the collection. I don't know whether you can scroll down to some of the others. That's just the exterior. And it is in Burbank. It is very near us. It is only about 10 minutes away from the Griffith Park campus. Quite frankly, most museums these days do not keep their collections on site. It's a diminution of otherwise much more valuable real estate. That should be for the public if you can possibly do it. And so we did want a nearby site, but an off-site, if you will, to actually house the collections. And it is a place not only where we can exercise stewardship of the collections, but they are quasi-public in the way that I just described. It's also even an area where objects can, in certain circumstances, be put on display, where there can be lectures, seminars, symposia, etc. also. It's not a place where tour buses pull up, but it is a much more open kind of area. It's about 100,000 square feet. It is a brilliant assemblage, if I may say so, of three previously different buildings. And happily, from our standpoint, it was purchased by the Board of Trustees in 2009 at rather rock-bottom prices. And we've just been told recently that it is now worth about 4 times the amount we paid to purchase it. So it's been a very nice investment that way. But I think that it is an important and much more important part of the integrated whole of a 21st century museum than those kinds of spaces and facilities were considered in the 20th century. And it also allows us the opportunity, with respect to the native collections that the Autry holds now, to have a very special place to engage native communities, native artists, native scholars, etc., in very important ways. I know that when I was the director of the National Museum of the American Indian, and having conversations with native communities who came to visit, they all acknowledged that it was great to be in a museum of ours that was on the National Mall, but where they always went automatically was the Cultural Resources Center, which was located out in Suitland. I think that's probably going to be somewhat the case here too. And so we're very proud to have that facility as part of
our staff has already been over there and they're taking notes, and we are going to try to
we want you to
either use your space or replicate that. So I want to say, I just want to, before ending, and maybe actually, I know there are a lot of people here who work for both of our museums and others and friends. If there are some questions, especially for Rick while he's here, why don't we do that if that's okay? But before doing that, we had a kind of controversial topic we were talking about the other day on the phone, and I pulled some slides. Is Stephanie Barron here? I think she was. Yeah, Stephanie. These are shows, by the way, these are your shows, the La Raza show that's at the Autry now as part of PST. We'll stop with the commercials of shows going on because we'll all see those upcoming shows. Stephanie Barron, who curated and put together this amazing exhibition of Chagall's work for the theater. And we got calls from, it was actually, Stephanie organized a talk here on this stage, and in the book, discussion of Chagall's sources for the Firebird, and the New York City Ballet's costumes, which were on view. And we got a call from the Hopi Heritage Foundation, who noted that the Chagall costume, and here's one on the right, the drawing is in the middle, and this is in the catalog, were inspired by the Hopi Kachina images, objects, which were readily available to Chagall in the 40s when he was in New York. Yeah. And we were wrestling with the questions, because the question that was raised from them is, today, it's sort of trying to retrieve the notion that the Kachina is only available in ceremony and shouldn't be spread in popular culture, for example, through Instagram and other means that kids of the Hopi Nation were seeing these very, to them clearly, not to all of our audience, but to them clearly Kachinas, and they weren't supposed to be.
Right.
And it was a big conundrum. It was never followed up. I think we had a little dialogue. We were open to dialogue. The first thing we said is we would have meetings. We discussed it. We were willing to change wall text and do all that. But it was a kind of conundrum about the question of imagery and what's appropriate.
Yeah.
And I reached out to Rick, who I think there are no answers, but it's an increasingly complex question about the ownership, not just of objects, but really of images, right?
That's correct. I think that really is. Everybody, I'm sure there are people here tonight who are familiar with the federal repatriation laws. That's one of the times when it was a great idea to have a lawyer as a museum director, because when that law was first enacted was when I became the director of the NMAI, and people consider that very much about, which it is very much about the return of physical, material, dimensional objects. There's no question about that, and if they fall into particular categories, and the cultural affiliation is established, then they must be returned to the tribe. But that is the tip of the iceberg. What sits below that is the fact that there are intangible as well as tangible aspects of heritage and culture. And so I think, without assuming that either you or I can plumb what the right answers are right here on the stage tonight, the fact is that questions will come up increasingly about these kinds of things. And it is very much the case that when you are talking about certain kinds of objects, even the image of them is something which is considered insensitive and objectionable by some tribes. So it is a conversation that I think museums should become more informed about and should be open to discussing with tribes. And it's you know, it's one of the challenges, I suppose, of being, which LACMA definitely is, a universal museum, as we defined that entity in the 20th and the 20th century for sure, where there was movement of objects, of aspects of heritage, even intangible aspects, songs, images, etc., from originating cultures into other museums. Right. And now, we were talking earlier about the fact that the axis wasn't just east-west anymore, it was also north-south. The fact is that is kind of generally a north-south question, because those originating communities whose objects were taken are now sort of coming back to those who took them and having conversations just like the one that you have had, and we need to expect them.
Yeah, I mean, and we were very open to the conversation. It's funny because right at the same time we're talking about, you know, this. It's different context, but the feelings those photographers had when Richard Prince was taking their images, from a legal perspective, theirs was work for hire. They didn't own those images anymore. Richard Prince is an artist. There were laws that would cover that, and it all got worked out from a legal perspective, as Chagall has his own copyright and there's not a law. But the question isn't law. It seems to me that we live in an era which I would argue is exciting, not in a negative sense.
I agree.
Where the meaning of images is being heightened all the time, that through tensions, but through this kind of question about can we all get along in a multiculturalism of living cultures, is that images are really powerful, and I think that puts the museum and our conversations in an important place, potentially.
Yeah, I think that's right, and you're correct, and I say this as a lawyer, we like to claim everything is a legal question, but this isn't just a legal question, and it really becomes also an ethical consideration. Even if something is not prohibited by the law, ethics are situational. And there could be a question about whether it is really ethical to do something. Then you get onto gradations of sensitivity and that kind of thing. But it's just that and I appreciate the conversation I've had with you about some of the questions that are raised by that. Honestly, if this were 25 to 30 years ago, those questions would probably just have been kicked away, period. I don't think your generation of museum directors, and you are younger than I, but you've gotten there very fast, is going to kick that kind of thing away. I think that we know that we must talk about those kinds of things now.
Well, and I think together there's a lot of chance for that. Are there a few questions, especially for Rick? Are there could this lead, this relationship and collaboration lead to others with the Smithsonian, with other institutions, to even create a greater breadth of sharing scholarship access to objects?
Well, I think you should say whatever you'd like to too, Michael, but I think that what we are attempting to do here, even in its incipiency, is the wave of the future. I think the time when museums could stand alone forever is gone. It's gone for practical reasons, because museums are under all kinds of pressures that relate to resources and the lack of them and all of that kind of thing, and there is, in mutual leveraging, there is an avenue for dealing with those kinds of things. But it's not even just that, as far as I'm concerned. It is simply that museums do their jobs better when there is this kind of cross-fertilization and willingness to collaborate on an interinstitutional basis. I just think that makes the product that the public sees a far better one. I know that's how I feel about how we can do our job. And you know, the challenge for museums these days is about relevancy. I mean, who cares what we do? And we need to be able to demonstrate that there's a reason why people should be interested in what we do. And these kinds of arrangements, I think, which expand our bandwidth in all kinds of ways, access to resources, collections, curatorial collaborations, et cetera, are a great strengthening of that kind of thing. I'd love it if you know, we could even invoke the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian actually has an affiliations program, but we need to go wider and deeper than even the Smithsonian affiliations program goes.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say we could have just had a meeting and discussed all this, and we were friends and we all worked together anyway. Why did we issue it as a press release? It was a provocation to suggest that I think all of us can continue to think. And I think in Los Angeles, if you look at Pacific Standard Time, the joint gift of the Mapplethorpe archive and works to the Getty and LACMA, that was very much a proposal we made that we could work together in ways we hadn't. We're trying to make that a little bit of a theme for the institutions in Los Angeles across, and I think the provocation is to the outside. But yes, the idea is, let's keep thinking of new ways to keep us relevant and working together in ways we haven't thought. When I was at the Museum of the Southwest and we were looking at the library, and I was looking at the recorded cylinders in the libraries, and then I saw what you were doing with the Resource Center, and we have so many curators who are thinking about literature and objects and prints and books. I don't know how much you know about the Rifkind Center here of German Expressionist books and prints, which is an exceptional library. I don't know that I know the connection between that and the Autry's ephemera, but yeah, that seems to be the natural way the resource center that you've built can function, because if there's library space, access to those things. If you look at exhibitions, we're all showing more and more of that. The GRI does that too at the Getty. And I think those are artifacts and objects that are as important both for scholarship. We also have, through digital media and through podcasts and other ways, to take all of the sounds as well as the printed text and other things to put them together. We've been regularly showing a gallery with the Rifkind Library and Center objects, and it's amazing how the public will stand there and look at a book and compare it to a print and sort of pay attention. So I don't know, that's up to our curators, but I think hopefully a lot can happen on that level. Well, it's funny that you mentioned the Olympics. I guess we could claim right here and now that we're starting that project and that collaboration, right? Yeah. We'll say we're claiming it, that this is the first conversation, because there already are conversations being held about bringing Los Angeles institutions and artists and creative forces together. If you go over to the Found in Translation exhibition that I was talking about that deals with Southern California and Mexico, its end boundary is the Olympics from '84. which were also patterned on, by the way, thinking of debts owed to other images on Mexico, where the arts became critical in design in the Mexico Olympics previous to that. And so I think now, with all of that behind us and the '84 experience, we have an unprecedented capacity, knowledge with the Pacific Standard Time, with the Getty's leadership, with all of that, with our partnerships, that we should definitely hit it out of the park culturally for the Olympics.
And if I
right?
could just add quickly to that, I think that there's no better place for something like what you're describing to happen than in Los Angeles. I will say that having grown up, and Michael in certain respects did too, on the East Coast in a museum, that there is just this profound sense of accessibility and openness, to say nothing of the genuine vast cultural diversity and art diversity that exists in Los Angeles in the West, that could be more empowering for the kind of notion that you're talking about. None of us does enough yet in that regard, as far as I'm concerned. We, of course, have the remarkable advantage and gift of having probably the second most important native collection in the United States, right in the Autry Museum. And La Raza was an unfolding, if you will, from my standpoint, for the Autry Museum of the American West. And but that needs to be amplified, you know, and this community, of all the ones I can think of, has such real reasons to be able to do that, and the inclination to do it in terms of what communities already sit here.
Yeah. What's so cool is that the Autry is defined because of Dean Autry, but the idea of from a place, from the West, and that's, we've been talking about creating that identity from this place. It's not to be excluding Europe or places far away, but to see them from our perspective, and it makes a different worldview. And I think there's an opportunity then to sort of, we've been doing that in Los Angeles, inclusive, but express this sense of place which we think is very special, and in many ways, including art of the traditional American West, has been marginalized in different ways, and now we're seeing it sort of as a center point. So I think that's exciting.
Well, that's it. Yeah, the question, and I think I heard it correctly, but if there were any lessons to be learned from indigenous or Aboriginal art in Australia, okay? I will tell you that when I became the director of the National Museum of the American Indian, I kind of looked around in 1990 to see sort of what was going on in the U.S. with respect to what people were doing with native collections, and I promptly left the country. I went to Australia and to New Zealand, where with respect to the Aboriginal community in Australia and the Maori community in New Zealand, much more was going on. And in particular, there's a lesson to learn from what happened there with respect to art that I think is very important. In my view, although nobody's journey is ever perfect, Australia and New Zealand did a better job at the outset in recognizing as an equal partner and participant in the art of those countries than the United States did with respect to native art. Native artists and art have struggled in a way in the United States to be recognized on an equal footing with other art. That did not happen in Australia or New Zealand, or for that matter in Canada. It was different in all of those countries. And I think that is changing. I think that what happened at the Met was powerful symbolism, that the Met actually took that collection in to the American Art Department, rather than putting it off, as I say is usually the case, in the Oceanic, North American, blah, 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 blah. And certainly that is the way we look at it at the Autry Museum of the American West. So to answer your question, my early visits, almost 30 years ago at this point, to Australia and New Zealand were highly defining and highly instructive to me. I'll be happy to talk about it from our standpoint, just based upon our own experience. About a little over a year ago, we redid a major portion of the Autry. I mean, within our existing four walls, but we took about 17 to 20,000 square feet of space and completely overhauled it. And that was to do a number of things. One was to be sure that we got out for the public to see far more than it had since the collection had actually been merged into the Autry, the Southwest Museum collection. And the modus operandi for planning those two exhibits, one is Mabel McKay, which was up here, but we didn't have time to actually look at it here, but you can still see it at the museum itself, as well as an exhibit called Human Nature. Both of those museums were done in direct consultation with Native communities and Native participants, Native artists, Native scholars, etc. And so our objective in doing those kinds of exhibitions is to do two things. One is to articulate openly and on a fundamentally unfiltered basis the voices of Native contributors themselves. Native people are highly skeptical of roadshows at this point by anybody, including museums. And so that isn't what we did, and that isn't what they would have let us do in any event. The second step is that in those exhibits, even though there was the presence of Native voice, and in Human Nature, it was really the primary initiating voice in addressing ecological and environmental subjects. The ultimate outcome, which I think ties directly to the Autry's mission of looking at these things on an intercultural basis, we all have a stake in it in the end, had a question which sets up in all of the various components of human nature, and that is, what are we all going to do about this in addressing these ecological and environmental questions? So yes, I think you need to respect voice and let voice speak for itself. I think in our case, what we also need to do is try to figure out how these voices intersect in constructing a whole that is both understandable and hopefully inspiring to the audiences who visit us.
That's a lot. I'm going to leave it at that. I mean, we're working with Los Angeles communities. I just want to say, I think you can feel the appreciation, Rick, from this crowd. We are so happy to be your partner here at LACMA. I think you can all feel the richness and the complexity of the many stories and many points of view that will be like a kaleidoscope, even more expansive, more multiple in our collaboration. Walking over here, Amy and I, your curator, we were talking about my dream to organize a Charles Russell, an American Western painter, who's I would love to see at LACMA, so we can do that together. And I'm sure every day there's going to be a new idea. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for what you've given to us, not only in your tenure here already in Los Angeles, but the National Museum of the American Indian is a real treasure and a great accomplishment for all of us. So it's great to have you here. Can't wait for what we can do together. Thank you, Rick.